Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to. We're going to be starting a little bit of a new series. We're going to cover all the gubernatorial elections. By the way, that is an awesome word, gubernatorial. But we're going to start covering these elections. I'm going to do them weekly as weekly updates because there are so many states we should get enough polls that I can actually update this weekly. Senate elections, I may have jumped the gun a little bit on that one because polls don't change as often as I expected them to be quite honest. Even though we are 4 months out, I would have expected more polling. Anyway, so there are 36 governor's mansions up for grabs this year. And we're going to start with them. By the way, the current governors, it's 33 Republicans to 16 Democrats with an independent in Alaska. This is what the map would look like going into 2019 as it stands. So we're going to go and start coloring them. So we're going to go to Alaska. There's only one. Oh, no, this is Alabama. I'm sorry. And KIV is pretty much the heavy favorite. I wouldn't even say anything. Let me just make sure we're all good. Close that. So I'm actually going to color this one as safe Republican. This one is Alaskan. This one's very weird because they have an independent governor who is running for re-election. There is actually a Democrat running and a Republican running. Seems like the Democrat is under most races coming in either third or second. The Republican is the only one who's polling in the 30s, other than the one poll from Alaska Survey Research, which had the Democrat at 33. And I would be reasoned with these three polls, considering, especially when you consider this as independent and a Democrat internal poll. The only nonpartisan one shows a Republican with a decent advantage over the Democrat, and the incumbent being booted. I'd be willing to say that Alaska leans Republican. So we're actually going to do that, which is strange because I actually had Alaska as leaning independent. So this is for Arizona, as you can see up here, and this may take a little bit longer just to go through them. Looking at the polls, you've got two internal polls from a Democrat against Doug Ducey, showing very narrow leads against, and this is Garcia, and the nonpartisan poll shows a 1% lead, so essentially a true toss-up. And against Fairley, the only non-internal poll shows Doug Ducey ahead. The Fairley poll shows Ducey ahead by more, interestingly enough. And the two Garcia internal polls don't really show anything different. I'd be willing to lean this one. I'm going to lean this one Republican for the simple reason that in true toss-ups I will always lean it towards the incumbent if there is an actual incumbent, not just the incumbent party. In which case, if there's an incumbent party but no incumbent, I take into account the state's traditional lean, in which way I'll lean a race in a true toss-up. So Arizona would likely stay in Republican hands. This is Arkansas, and as you can see, the only poll shows a massive lead for Hutchinson, and all the professionals say this is safe for the Republicans. I would agree with that. For California, I agree it should be solid Democrat. There's only one poll showing anything other than a massive Democrat lead, and that's a Cox internal poll from March. And I am obviously skeptical of that. I'm going to, for obvious reasons, call that one safe for the Democrats. In Colorado, you have an internal poll showing a 7-point lead and a 5-point lead from late May, early June, showing a reasonable lead for the Democrat. I'm going to lean this one to the Democrats, but oops, I just bumped those. So that's a lean Democrat. And in Connecticut, I think it would be reasonable to say that this race should lean Democrat. There's a fairly unpopular governor in Connecticut, which is the only reason why I'm not calling it likely or even safe Democrat. And gubernatorial elections tend to be a lot more isolated compared to Senate races. Local politics matters a lot more. So a Republican can be successful in a state like Massachusetts or New York, and a Democrat could be successful in a place like Kansas or Oklahoma or Idaho or South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, those types of places. And in Florida, this race is definitely a true toss-up. And Putnam, in most polls has a lead over most Democrats. But I don't think it's enough to take it out of the true toss-up column. Rick Scott is reasonably popular, and that might help Putnam. And Florida tends to, even though it's very much a battleground and a swing state, at the state level, they tend to be ever so slightly more Republican. So, but it is a Democrat wave year. I think most people are willing to say that if they absolutely had to choose, they'd say Putnam is going to win. I'm a little skeptical. I want to leave this one as a true toss-up, but I feel I should call them because I don't like to have anything labeled as a toss-up. And I'm going to lean it towards the Republicans, but I wish there was something that wasn't as definitive, because I have very low confidence in that prediction because of the nature of Florida, as well as the nature of the fact, again, it's a Democrat year, but local politics are really weird. Okay, so let's go to Georgia. There's only one poll against the, I believe, the Republican primary hasn't happened. There's a runoff. But in most polls, this person, Casey Cagle, oh yeah, I remember him now. Yeah, Cagle probably is going to win the runoff, and going based off of sorry about the phone. Going based off of the polls involving him, the nonpartisan polls show Casey Cagle ahead of Stacey Abrams. And even against Brian Kemp would do reasonably well because but yeah, there's a lot more undecideds, and a lot of the undecideds in this race aren't willing to commit until there is a Republican nominee that's a known factor. So I would even say this probably doesn't even show the full picture. So I'm going to actually put this as likely Republican, just because of how difficult it is even though I think the margin's going to be within 5% in Georgia, with how difficult it is for a Democrat to overcome that 5% gap, that is why I'm making it likely instead of leans. Goodness gracious. I'm sorry about that. Hawaii, anyone saying other than safe Democrat is crazy. So we're not even going to spend too much time there. Idaho, the prediction is solid Republican, and I would mostly agree with that. There's no polls out of Idaho just yet. We'll get to those. Bruce Rauner, he is definitely vulnerable, as this states, and polling indicates the same. He even loses in an internal poll, but that's from October. All the 2018 polls, and we're going to go ahead and ignore the Democrat internal poll. Every poll here shows Bruce Rauner losing to J.B. Pritzker, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. I'm only putting it as likely, not safe, because Rauner is still the incumbent, and there is incumbency advantage, obviously, but I don't think it'll be enough to help him. Iowa, we've only got one poll, and this is from Selzer and Company, one of the few A+ rated pollsters by 538. They're a very, very good company when it comes to polling. So I tend to factor their polls in a lot more heavily than anyone else's, simply because they are very accurate. And it shows Kim Reynolds in the lead. So I'm going to lean Iowa towards the Republicans for that, because of that. Go to Kansas, where the Republicans are more than likely going to win. I'm going to go with the rest of the predictions, which show it is only likely rather than safe, just to be on the safe side. Maine, I consider this one a true toss-up. We don't know how to factor in ranked voting yet, so I'm going to lean it towards the Democrats because I expect that to happen more than I expect the Republicans to come out ahead when it comes to ranked voting. The next state is Maryland, where Larry Hogan has been consistently polling ahead of Ben Jealous. And yeah, Ben is going to be he's going to be envious of how Larry Hogan's doing, but instead of jealous, people misuse the word jealous a lot. So I'm actually going to rate this as likely Republican because Larry Hogan is a fairly popular incumbent. And going to Massachusetts, Charlie Baker polls very much ahead of just about everyone. And this is one of the few times I would say Massachusetts is a safe Republican, and I think that's just conventional wisdom. We go up to Michigan. Bill Schwett is the likely Republican nominee, and he does pretty well enough for it to be considered a toss-up, even though the Democrats should be favored in this race by a decent amount. I consider this race a toss-up, but I'm going to lean it towards the Democrats because it's a Democrat year, and the state has historically voted Democrat, and the Republican incumbent who is not running for re-election isn't that popular. So you go up to Minnesota. Tim Pawlenty is more than likely going to be the Republican nominee. And I personally would have this race as a toss-up because Tim Pawlenty was popular in Minnesota, I'm not sure how popular he still is, but every Democrat beats him in the only polls we have so far, so I'm going to lean this towards the Democrats. But Pawlenty definitely can make the race competitive. So we go over to Nevada, where there's a Republican incumbent who is not running for re-election, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And the primaries had almost identical turnout. And I think they're... And looking at the polls, including this recent one, I'm going to, of course, ignore the internal polls. I rate this as a true toss-up, but the state has a historical slight lean towards the Republicans, but now that's kind of flipped and it's become more of a blue-leaning swing state. But Brian Sandoval is fairly popular, and he might be able to help. I'm going to go ahead and lean this blue just because it is a Democrat year, and there's a Senate race that will probably factor in a little bit. So we go over to Nebraska, which is safe Republican. That should be expected. Go to New Hampshire, where Chris Sununu is fairly popular, and every poll shows him beating every person. I'm actually going to rate this as safe, judging by the margins, even though there's still a lot of undecided voters. I'll rate this as likely Republican. Go to New Mexico, I'm actually going to put this as likely Democrat. Susana Martinez is not that popular, and it's a Democrat year, and even the Republican internal polls show the Republican behind. So I'm putting it as likely, simply because I think the margin is going to be close enough that it will be a competitive race, but it's pretty obvious who's going to win. So now moving on to New York, which I'm going to rate as safe for the Democrats, despite this hilarious poll showing the Libertarian winning over 50% and tying, and only being just barely behind Cuomo. It's a little hilarious. We look at the only poll that includes... We look at the serious polls. It's actually... Yeah. No. Okay. I'm going to rate this as safe Republican. Or, not Republican, safe Democrat. Why did I say Republican? Yeah, New York is not going to be competitive at all. But that Libertarian internal poll was hilarious. Let's be honest there. Moving on to Ohio, which is rated as a toss-up by just about everyone. And looking at the polls, it is definitely competitive. But most people have DeWine leading. I'm going to ever so slightly lean this Republican. This one's another race like Florida where it's very competitive. Mary Fallon in Oklahoma, which we're on now, isn't super popular, but it should be expected to go Republican anyway. I don't really see it doing anything else. I'm actually going to rate this as safe. You know, there's only so much having an unpopular governor can do to your to a campaign, especially when your state's as red as Oklahoma is. There's only now looking at Oregon. If you go back to 2017, it looked fairly competitive, but going into 2018, not so much. Except for this one internal poll, which maybe it's more competitive than we think, but I'm skeptical of that. So I'm going to write this as likely Democrat, though there is a non-zero chance that the Republicans win it. But I doubt it. I doubt any other poll this year is going to show it like this, or any non-internal poll is going to show the Republican in the lead. Going to Pennsylvania, I think we can rate this as likely Democrat, going based off of the polls, but also because we have a Democrat incumbent. So, and I'm going to put this as likely Democrat. Go to Rhode Island, and it's actually competitive. There's a poll showing one of the Republican candidates tied or slightly behind. Again, this is an internal poll, so ignore that. There is actually a nonpartisan poll showing the Republican ahead. And I believe Fung is... Yeah, I believe Fung is the expected nominee for the Republicans in Rhode Island. And yeah. So I'm actually only going to rate this Rhode Island as leans Democrat because it's a lot more competitive than I think people are willing to give it credit for, considering it is. South Carolina, yeah, I would agree with that. I'm going to rate it as solid Republican. And same with South Dakota. We go to Tennessee, and every poll shows the Republican ahead. Doesn't matter whether it's Diane Black or Randy Boyd or Beth Harwell or Bill Lee in this one poll. And it really doesn't matter who the Democrat is. The Republican is ahead by a decent margin. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm only putting Tennessee as likely Republican because there is, again, a Senate race with a popular Democrat that might play into the gubernatorial election a little bit. Texas, I'm going to rank this as safe Republican. Greg Abbott is decently popular in Texas, and it's still a red state, whether Democrats want to believe it or not. You go to Vermont, and while we have no polling, we do know that Phil Scott is one of the most popular incumbent governors in the nation, along with Charlie Baker of Massachusetts. Now we go to Wisconsin, which is the tough one to talk about, because a lot of people seem to think that Wisconsin is going to go blue this year because Scott Walker isn't that popular. And looking at the polling, that there's only one poll that shows a Democrat ahead, and that was an internal poll from that candidate. every nonpartisan poll shows Scott Walker ahead by anywhere from 4 to 9%, 9% there. That's 13%. That's 8%. So I feel comfortable keeping this as leans Republican. And we've got one more left, and that's Wyoming, and I don't expect that to do anything but stay Republican. So when we scroll down, the Democrats get a net of 5 seats, whereas the Republicans only lose 4. And if you look at the current one, you can see which states flip. Maine, Michigan, Illinois, New Mexico, and Nevada, but the Republicans would pick up Alaska. So that's the map as I see it at this moment. I'll update you next Friday, of course, when we get more polls. And tomorrow, I'm going to say later in the evening, I'm going to do the, whatever that accent stamp or mark is, just because, why not? It'll give you guys something else other than a politics video. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed. I'll see you next time. Take it easy. Bye.